Guns, explosions, annihilation, alien invaders, and more explosions. Welcome to Sin and Punishment.
Peel away that mask and reveal your true nature, monster.
Developed by Treasure, who is most known for 2D shoot-'em-up games like Ikaruga, Radiant Silvergun, and Gunstar Heroes, created their first 3D game for the Nintendo 64 exclusive to Japan, known as Sin and Punishment. A bullet hell shoot 'em up with the main mechanics of the game being to dodge, slice, and shoot your way through a horde of enemies to reach the next stage. And boy, is it oh so satisfying. Sin and Punishment's development began around 1997 when Treasure wrote the original proposal and submitted it to Nintendo. The original inspiration to develop the game was the Nintendo 64 controller. The Nintendo 64 was built around the idea of having two different positions for holding its controller. The right position, the most common way to hold the controller popularized by Mario 64, and the left position. President of Treasure, Masato Maegawa, felt as though the left positioning was underutilized and thought that it would make for an interesting game, and so started developing a new game to use this position. Nintendo foresaw this controller setup feeling unnatural to players, so to counter this, they planned on releasing a controller at the time with a movement sensor, but ultimately, the idea was scrapped as it would have further lengthened development, and the sensor technology wouldn't be finalized until 2006 with the Nintendo Wii. Sin and Punishment started off with an extremely small team of only 2 programmers and 2 designers. Maegawa decided to go with the absolute minimum in the beginning stages because he felt as though having too many people giving their output on what the game should be would ruin the vision. But by the end of the game's development, more people joined in, which then became the most people they've ever had work on a game at a single time.
Listen. A ruffian swarm is approaching your position. I've also confirmed Radawn's location.
The director from the Nintendo side of things was Hitoshi Yamagami, most notable for Dr. Mario, as well as generously extending development for Xenoblade Chronicles when Tetsuya Takahashi was ready to cut out chunks of the game to meet the game's deadline. In an Iwata Asks interview, Yamagami states, "I found working with Treasure complicated and they struggled to meet deadlines. When he asked Treasure when the game would be done, they would respond, 'We don't know. We'll show you something when it's done.' I'd say, well, that causes some trouble, and they'd say, but if we don't know, we don't know." They went back and forth like that for a long time. When the prototype was finally done and Yamagami got his hands on the game, he was amazed by just how much they were able to accomplish with Sin and Punishment and just how much Sin and Punishment pushed the hardware of the Nintendo 64. But he did have one suggestion, which was to lower the difficulty, stating that the game was too hard for him and would most likely be too hard for the average consumer, in which Treasure responded, "Then you're not good enough to be in charge of this project. Everyone in our company can do it. Anyone who can't do this can't be part of our team." This back and forth regarding Sin and Punishment's difficulty went on for a little over a year, and then they finally came to an agreement to lower the difficulty, but still keep that distinct Treasure style intact.
Saki! Oh, Saki! Good morning, Saki.
Good morning, Iron.
Glass Soldier was the game's name throughout most of its development because the character was fragile like glass. Around that time, a lot of the games coming out had titles written in katakana, and it wasn't uncommon for games written in katakana to get buried among other releases. One of the releases around that time had a working title of Red and Black, which we now know as Perfect Dark.
Perfect Dark. Rated M for mature.
So Yamagami thought, If Red and Black was alright, why not Sin and Punishment? But the only problem now was that the title, Sin and Punishment, felt really obscure and hard to sell, so he consulted the younger staff for suggestions, in which they suggested using kanji that reads Chikyu, meaning Earth, and Hoshi, meaning star. Both words were crucial to the story, so the official name of the game would be Hoshi no Keishosha, which translates to Sin and Punishment, successor of the Earth. The other option was Dark Wasteland, which they decided against because they didn't want the player to think that the game was focused around a wasteland. Sin and Punishment is an on-rail shooting gallery that only lets you move either left or right, while the action is happening from a 3D behind-the-back perspective. Your main movement and attack options are strafing left to right, slashing enemies, or reflecting projectiles with your sword, shooting, dodge rolling, and double jumping. It might not seem like there's a whole lot to the gameplay of Sin and Punishment, but every possible mechanic is really used to its full potential, and not one movement option or attack ever feels like it's unnecessary, making it one of the most tightest, challenging, and fun shoot-em-ups of its time. When aiming at opponents, you have two different aiming options at your disposal, free shot and lock on. Lock on is as the name implies, lock on to your enemy, and all you really have to do is worry about dodging incoming projectiles on the screen. Free aim requires you to move the reticle with the analog stick, but it has the advantage of being the stronger option. One area in the game requires you to use free aim as well, so it's worth getting good at before that time comes. The game also lets you play the game in co-op mode with an extra person, where one person controls the movement and the other person is responsible for killing the enemies. For a game that can be beaten in a little over an hour, the story is surprisingly really good. A lot of people will tend to look past the story, calling it a convoluted mess and not to pay it any mind, but there's definitely some interesting events happening in the world of Sin and Punishment that I think it's worth paying attention to. Sin and Punishment takes place in a dystopian future of 2007. The entire planet is suffering from famine, so scientists made a new food source in Japan called ruffians. Just think of them as monsters. Eventually, however, they became uncontrollable and started attacking people, so the almighty USA, known as the Armed Forces, jumps in to save the day. And by save the day, I mean kill the ruffians, but also oppress the citizens of Japan, as can be seen in the introduction.
Achi! Achi! Hurry! Save us, Achi!
Are these the rebels?
One group of them, sir. They have no strength to resist any longer.
But the leaders are still alive. There's no time now. Join the troops intercepting the ruffians.
So a resistance rises up to bring back Japan from the attack of the ruffians and stop the armed volunteers. The resistance is led by a woman named Achi. Achi has special powers, and by using blood, she can bring people back to life and turn them into ruffians as well. Saki and Iron, the two protagonists of the game, were saved and also given special powers due to Achi's blood. Brad, one of the main antagonists of the story, was once a disciple of Achi, but ended up leaving her and joining the armed forces. And the story just goes from there. You find out that Achi isn't from Earth and that she just needed to raise the perfect super soldier to fight off other superpowered beings not from Earth as well. This, however, really isn't explored until the second game. And it also gives a little glimpse into the future of Sin and Punishment Star successor, showing the future 10 years from now, where Iron and Saki have a son named Issa, who ends up being the protagonist for the second game. Sin and Punishment was well received at the time of its release and became a cult hit from those who played it and from those who imported it. A lot of people even holding it in high regards, going as far as to say it's one of the best games on the Nintendo 64. Unfortunately for fans in Western territories, Sin and Punishment wouldn't get released for the Nintendo 64, even though it was fully dubbed and catered for the Western audience, because Nintendo was more focused on transitioning to the next generation of consoles with the Nintendo GameCube.
Nintendo GameCube.
But with Nintendo finally allowing gamers access to a wide variety of older consoles via the Wii Shop channel, some even Japanese-only games, Sin and Punishment received a lot of demand, and with it already featuring English voice acting, it was a no-brainer. It wouldn't be available for purchase until 2007 when it hit the Wii Shop channel, where it was met with much fan praise as well as menu translations. And that's Sin and Punishment. Comparisons to Star Fox 64 were obviously going to be made, and still continue to be made from those that played both games. Star Fox 64 no doubt was the more popular game, but I think a case could be made for Sin and Punishment being the better game. Whatever side of the fence you stand on, you're definitely on the side of a high quality game. In part 2, we'll take a look at the follow-up game, Sin and Punishment Star Successor, one of the best shoot-'em-ups ever made, one of the best games on the Wii, a perfect showcase for the beauty of motion controls, and one of the best, most overlooked Nintendo games ever created. Until next time.